Every nation has a story, but America's story is unlike any other. It is a tale of resilience, revolution, innovation, conflict, and dreams, woven through centuries, shaped by diverse voices, and still unfolding today. This is not just a history. This is the epic journey of the United States of America. Welcome to our channel. Today, we embark on a journey through the annals of time to explore the full history of America, from its ancient roots to the modern world power we know today. Whether you're a student, a history enthusiast, or simply curious about how America came to be, this video will guide you through every significant era, event, and transformation. In this video, we will delve into the complete history of America, from its prehistory to colonization, British rule, revolution, Civil War, World Wars, Cold War, and modern United States of America. So, without any further delay, let's begin to explore. Before there was an America, before there was even a name for this land, there were people. Millions of people, living, building, thriving across the vast continent we now call the United States. Long before Columbus ever set sail, North America was home to hundreds of distinct Native American nations, each with its own language, traditions, and way of life. These weren't primitive bands of hunters. They were complex societies with cities, governments, trade routes, and belief systems deeply connected to the land. Let's begin in the Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, built remarkable stone dwellings into cliffs and high desert plateaus. At places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, they constructed multi-story buildings, irrigation systems, and observatories aligned with the stars, evidence of deep astronomical knowledge. In the Midwest and Southeast, the Mississippian culture rose around 800 AD. Their largest city, Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, once housed over 20,000 people, bigger than London at the same time. They built enormous earthen mounds for religious and political purposes, and their society was rich in agriculture, ceremony, and hierarchy. Further north, in the Great Lakes and Northeast woodlands, powerful alliances formed. The Iroquois Confederacy, made up of 5, later 6 nations, developed one of the earliest known democratic systems. Their Great Law of Peace even inspired parts of the U.S. Constitution centuries later. In the Great Plains, tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche lived nomadic lives, following massive bison herds. Their mastery of horseback riding, after the introduction of horses by the Spanish, made them fierce warriors and agile hunters. Meanwhile, on the Pacific Northwest coast, groups like the Haida, Tlingit, and Chinook carved towering totem poles and held potlatches, grand ceremonial feasts that reflected their complex social rankings and wealth systems. Their lives were rooted in fishing, especially salmon, and they built longhouses that stood for generations. To the south, in present-day California and the deserts beyond, smaller tribes adapted ingeniously to their environment. They developed sustainable methods of hunting, gathering, and land stewardship, skills passed down for millennia. These were not forgotten people. They were the first Americans. Their legacy is etched into the land, whispered in the winds, and still alive today. By the time Columbus arrived in 1492, it's estimated that over 10 million indigenous people lived in what is now the U.S. Their civilizations were diverse and widespread, proving that America's history did not begin with European discovery. It began long before, with the First Nations who called this land home. In 1492, the world changed forever. A sailor named Christopher Columbus, backed by the Spanish crown, crossed the vast Atlantic. He wasn't the first to reach the Americas, but his voyage sparked a global collision of worlds. Though Columbus never stepped foot on what is now the United States, his arrival in the Caribbean unleashed a tidal wave of exploration, conquest, and colonization. The age of discovery had begun, and the lands of North America soon became the target of European ambition. Spain led the charge. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida, claiming it for Spain and naming it La Florida. Over the next decades, Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado ventured deep into the southeast and southwest, searching for riches and mythical cities of gold. They encountered powerful native societies and often left destruction in their wake. In the southwest, Spanish missions and forts spread into present-day Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Here they built missions to convert indigenous people to Christianity, forever altering native cultures and spiritual beliefs. Meanwhile, the French moved down from Canada, exploring the Great Lakes, the Mississippi River, and founding settlements like Quebec and New Orleans. They built a fur trade empire through alliances with native tribes like the Huron and Algonquin. The Dutch, too, joined the race. In 1624, they founded New Amsterdam at the mouth of the Hudson River, today known as New York City. Their colony would be short-lived, but their influence remains in names like Harlem, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. But it was the English who would eventually dominate the eastern seaboard. In 1607, over a century after Columbus's voyage, the first permanent English colony was founded at Jamestown, Virginia. Sponsored by the Virginia Company, the settlers came in search of gold, but found only hardship, starvation, disease, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy. Despite the odds, Jamestown survived. Tobacco cultivation, driven by the labor of enslaved Africans and indentured servants, turned the struggling outpost into a profitable colony. And so began the English foothold in the New World, a foothold that would expand into 13 colonies, spark revolutions, and ultimately give birth to a nation. This period of exploration laid the foundation for everything that would follow: settlement, expansion, conflict, and the fight for independence. By the early 1700s, the Atlantic coast of North America was no longer wild, uncharted land. It was home to bustling ports, growing cities, and a patchwork of English colonies, 13 of them stretching from Maine to Georgia. Each of the 13 colonies had its own story, its own founding purpose, and its own cultural identity. Some were born out of economic ambition, like Virginia, built on tobacco and plantation wealth. Others were havens for religious freedom, like Massachusetts, settled by Puritans fleeing persecution, or Pennsylvania, founded by the Quaker William Penn as a holy experiment. Here's a quick breakdown of the 13 colonies. New England colonies: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Middle colonies: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Southern colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Though they were all under British rule, each colony had its own government, laws, and identity. Most were self-governing, with elected assemblies, though still loyal to the English crown. But this freedom came with limits. The colonies were growing fast. By 1750, over 1 million people lived in British America. But they were also growing restless. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. The British government saw the colonies as sources of revenue. They passed laws to control trade, like the Navigation Acts, which forced the colonies to sell goods only to Britain. British ships got rich. Colonial merchants got angry. Then came the French and Indian War. 1754 to 1763, known globally as the 7 Years' War. Britain and France clashed over territory in North America. Though the British emerged victorious, the war left them deeply in debt. And who did they expect to help pay that debt? The colonies. That's when everything changed. New taxes, new restrictions, and a new kind of American spirit began to rise. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed paper goods, everything from newspapers to playing cards. The colonists responded with outrage. No taxation without representation. Protest groups like the Sons of Liberty formed. British tax collectors were harassed, boycotts spread, and violence simmered. In 1770, British soldiers fired on protesters in Boston. 5 civilians were killed. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, turned public opinion sharply against the British. Then, in 1773, the spark finally lit the fire. The Tea Act gave a monopoly to the British East India Company. In protest, American patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships and dumped over 300 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsh punishments, the intolerable acts. But instead of submission, they got defiance. The colonies were no longer just British outposts. They were ready to stand up, to unite, and to fight for something bigger: freedom. And so, the stage was set for revolution. They were farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, and merchants, ordinary people, facing the greatest empire the world had ever known. And yet, they stood up. They picked up arms. They chose rebellion over submission. They chose liberty. In April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War rang out in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. British troops had come to seize colonial weapons, but they were met by local militias, citizen soldiers called Minutemen. The American Revolution had begun. Soon, battles spread across the colonies. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, where leaders like John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson debated the future. Could they truly break free from Britain? Then, on July 4th, 1776, they made it official. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence. Written by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence was not just a breakup letter with the British Crown. It was a bold statement of human rights and national identity. The United States of America was born on paper. But in reality, the war was far from over. The British sent massive armies, powerful navies, and experienced generals like General Cornwallis. The Americans, led by General George Washington, faced harsh winters, supply shortages, and repeated defeats. But they didn't give up. In 1777, a crucial victory came at the Battle of Saratoga, convincing France to join the American cause. French troops, ships, and money tipped the scales. Spain and the Dutch would later join too. Then, in 1781, the war reached its climax at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington's forces, along with French troops under General Rochambeau and the navy of Admiral de Grasse, surrounded the British. After days of bombardment, General Cornwallis surrendered. The war was over. The impossible had been done. A group of colonies had defeated an empire. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized American independence and withdrew its forces. But independence was just the beginning. Victory had been won, but freedom had to be built. Brick by brick, law by law, word by word. After the Revolutionary War, the newly formed United States faced an enormous challenge: how to govern itself. At first, the country operated under the Articles of Confederation, a loose alliance of 13 states with a very weak central government. There was no president, no national court, and Congress had little power to tax or enforce laws. The result? Chaos. States printed their own money. Trade was disorganized. Farmers in debt rebelled, most famously in Shays' Rebellion of 1786. It became clear, if the nation was to survive, it needed a stronger foundation. So, in 1787, delegates from across the country met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. In a hot summer behind closed doors, some of the greatest minds in American history debated, argued, and finally crafted the supreme law of the land. The result was the U.S. Constitution, a revolutionary document that created a federal government with checks and balances across three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. It was not perfect. It was born with contradictions. Freedom was promised, yet slavery remained legal. But it laid the groundwork for a government of the people, by the people, for the people. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first President of the United States. He set key precedents: peaceful transitions of power, a two-term limit, and the importance of staying out of foreign entanglements. In 1791, the Bill of Rights was added, 10 powerful amendments that guaranteed freedoms like speech, religion, and the press, as well as protection against tyranny. But divisions soon emerged. Two political parties formed. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, wanted a strong central government. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, favored states' rights and a more agrarian society. Foreign affairs also shook the young republic. The French Revolution, tensions with Britain, and domestic unrest like the Whiskey Rebellion all tested the government's strength. But through every crisis, the American Republic held. A fragile idea was becoming a living nation. By the early 1800s, the United States had doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase and was beginning to look westward, toward expansion, opportunity, and conflict. A new century had begun, and with it came a bold vision that America was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This belief would drive expansion, innovation, and conflict. This vision was called Manifest Destiny, the idea that the United States was meant to expand across the continent. It wasn't just about land, it was about power, pride, and a belief in American exceptionalism. In 1703, President Thomas Jefferson struck a deal with France, the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, the U.S. doubled in size, gaining land from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Explorers Lewis and Clark, with the help of a Native American woman named Sacagawea, journeyed west to map and document the new frontier. Soon, pioneers and settlers followed, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, carving roads and railways. The Oregon Trail, the California Gold Rush of 1849, and the building of new states pushed the U.S. westward. But expansion came at a cost. Native American tribes were displaced, deceived, and destroyed. Entire cultures were uprooted through war, broken treaties, and forced relocation, like the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokees died after being expelled from their lands. At the same time, a deeper conflict was brewing: slavery. As the nation expanded, so did the question: would new states allow slavery or ban it? The North was industrializing, with factories, railroads, and growing cities. The South, however, remained deeply dependent on agriculture and enslaved labor. Cotton was king, and slavery fueled the Southern economy. Tensions rose with every new state added to the Union. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all temporary solutions. Then came the spark. In 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid on Harper's Ferry, hoping to ignite a slave revolt. He failed, but his actions sent shockwaves through the nation. And in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president, without a single Southern electoral vote, Southern states began to secede from the Union. One by one, they broke away and formed the Confederate States of America. America was divided, North versus South, Union versus Confederacy, brother against brother. It was civil war. The American Civil War began in 1861 with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. It would last 4 bloody years. Over 620,000 lives were lost, more than in any other American war. Major battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run turned farmland into graveyards. The Union, led by Lincoln and generals like Ulysses S. Grant, slowly pushed back the Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. Though it didn't end slavery overnight, it turned the war into a fight not just for Union, but for human freedom. Finally, in April 1865, General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union was preserved, slavery was abolished, but the wounds of war ran deep, and the fight for true equality was far from over. The guns had fallen silent. The Confederacy had surrendered. But peace did not mean unity. Now, America faced a new challenge, healing a nation torn apart and redefining what freedom truly meant. The Reconstruction era began in 1865, immediately after the Civil War. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its society in turmoil. And for the first time in American history, millions of formerly enslaved people were free. President Abraham Lincoln had called for a gentle reunification, with malice toward none, with charity for all. But just days after the war ended, he was assassinated, shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's death changed everything. Vice President Andrew Johnson became president and clashed with Congress over how to rebuild the South. Radical Republicans wanted deep change, equal rights, federal protections, and punishment for Confederate leaders. In this period, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all born in the U.S. The 15th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote. For a brief moment, there was hope. Black Americans voted, held office, started businesses, and built schools and churches. Hiram Revels became the first black U.S. senator in 1870. It seemed like a new America was emerging, but resistance came fast and brutal. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and terror to stop black progress. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing segregation and suppressing black votes. By the late 1870s, federal troops withdrew from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and leaving many promises of freedom unfulfilled. As the South struggled to rebuild, the North surged forward into a new era, the age of industry. The Industrial Revolution transformed the American economy. Railroads stretched across the continent. Cities exploded in size. Immigrants poured in from Europe, bringing their skills and dreams. Factories rose, powered by coal, steel, and oil. Captains of industry like Andrew Carnegie, steel, John D. Rockefeller, oil, and J.P. Morgan, finance, became some of the richest men in history. Some called them robber barons for their ruthless tactics. Meanwhile, workers, including children, labored in dangerous conditions for low wages. Slums grew. Pollution darkened city skies. The labor movement was born, with strikes and protests demanding rights and dignity. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act tried to limit monopolies. Activists and reformers began to speak out. Journalists called muckrakers exposed corruption, child labor, and poverty. America was rising, its economy was booming, but behind the steel and smoke, deep divides remained between rich and poor, white and black, immigrant and native-born. By the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. had become a global economic powerhouse, but it was a nation still searching for fairness, justice, and its true identity. The 20th century opened with promise and warning. Technology, cities, and wealth were rising, but so were global tensions. America, once isolated, was now being pulled into the heart of world affairs. The First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, triggered by a tangled web of alliances, nationalism, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. At first, the United States stayed neutral, but then came the sinking of the Lusitania, unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance against the U.S. By 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war. "The world must be made safe for democracy," Wilson declared. Over 2 million American soldiers, known as doughboys, crossed the Atlantic to join the fight. The U.S. helped turn the tide, and in 1918, the war ended. But peace was complicated. At the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson's dream of a League of Nations to prevent future wars fell short, especially when the U.S. Senate rejected joining it. America returned home, powerful, proud, but cautious. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. The 1920s roared with jazz, flappers, speakeasies, and economic boom. Radios, automobiles, and movies became mainstream. It was an era of cultural and technological revolution. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Banks failed. Businesses collapsed. The U.S. was thrown into the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in its history. Unemployment soared to 25%. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Desperation filled the air. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, was elected president. His New Deal programs created jobs, built infrastructure, and reformed banks and markets. Social Security was born. Hope slowly returned, but across the ocean, darkness was rising again. In the 1930s, Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, alongside fascist leaders in Italy and Japan. World War II erupted in 1939, but again, America stayed neutral. That changed on December 7, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. "A date which will live in infamy," declared Roosevelt. The next day, the U.S. entered the war. America became the arsenal of democracy, producing planes, tanks, and weapons at an unstoppable rate. Men went off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, while women filled factories back home. The war was vast and brutal. D-Day, Stalingrad, Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Bulge. But in 1945, victory came. Nazi Germany surrendered in May. Then, in August, the world changed forever. The U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan to surrender. Over 200,000 people died. The atomic age had begun. America emerged from the ashes of war not just victorious, but as the most powerful nation on Earth. The world would never be the same. The battlefield was silent, but the war was not over. A new kind of conflict had begun. not with guns and armies alone, but with spies, satellites, and the terrifying shadow of nuclear war. After World War II, the world split into two opposing camps: the United States, championing democracy and capitalism; the Soviet Union, pushing communism and authoritarian control. This ideological rivalry sparked the Cold War, a global standoff that lasted nearly half a century. Both superpowers began stockpiling nuclear weapons, creating the chilling reality of mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side launched, both would be annihilated. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. The arms race escalated with the development of hydrogen bombs, intercontinental missiles, and nuclear submarines. But the Cold War wasn't just about weapons. It reached for the stars. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. America responded by founding NASA, leading to the dramatic space race. In 1969, the U.S. won that race when Neil Armstrong became the first human to walk on the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The Cold War spread across the globe in the form of proxy wars, conflicts where the US and USSR supported opposing sides without directly fighting each other. In Korea, 1950 to 1953, American and UN forces fought to stop communist expansion. The result was a divided Korea, North and South still at odds today. In Vietnam, the US tried to prevent a communist takeover in the South. But after years of brutal fighting and public protest, American troops withdrew in 1973. In 1975, Saigon fell, and the war ended in communist victory. While America was fighting communism abroad, a different battle was being fought at home: the fight for civil rights. All men are created equal. But for many Americans, that promise still hadn't been kept. In the 1950s and 60s, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Martin Luther King Jr. led peaceful protests and delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed segregation and protected black voters. But the struggle wasn't limited to race. Women, Native Americans, Latinos, LGBTQ+ communities all began demanding equality and recognition. In 1962, the world came dangerously close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 tense days, the world held its breath until a secret deal diffused the crisis. After that, both superpowers began to cool tensions, entering a period called détente, marked by arms treaties and diplomatic talks. But conflict reignited in the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan took a hard stance against the Soviet Union, famously calling it the evil empire. But behind the rhetoric, change was already brewing. In the USSR, reformer Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, trying to save the crumbling Soviet system. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of division, was torn down. East and West Germany reunited. And in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union was gone. The Berlin Wall was rubble. And for the first time in history, the United States stood as the world's lone superpower. The U.S. led a global coalition in the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, pushing Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. The economy boomed. The internet exploded into public use. President Bill Clinton oversaw a period of prosperity, but his administration was also rocked by scandal and impeachment. As the new millennium approached, America was riding a wave of innovation. Tech companies were rising, walls were falling, and democracy seemed to be spreading across the globe. Then, everything changed. On September 11, 2001, America suffered its deadliest attack since Pearl Harbor. Terrorists from Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, and another into a Pennsylvania field. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and in a single morning, the world was changed forever. The U.S., under President George W. Bush, launched the War on Terror. In 2001, American forces invaded Afghanistan to eliminate Al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban. 2 years later, the U.S. invaded Iraq, citing fears of weapons of mass destruction, a claim later found to be false. The wars lasted for years. Thousands of U.S. soldiers died. Millions of civilians were displaced. The cost, financial and emotional, was staggering. Back home, the country entered a new era. The 2008 financial crisis brought Wall Street to its knees and triggered the worst recession since the Great Depression. Millions lost jobs and homes, but in the midst of hardship, history was made. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first black president of the United States. His election marked a milestone in America's long struggle with race and equality. Under his leadership, the U.S. passed the Affordable Care Act, reformed financial markets, and ordered the operation that killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. At the same time, new challenges emerged. Climate change became a growing concern. Social media changed how people communicated and received news. Political divisions deepened, with sharp debates over immigration, healthcare, and gun rights. In 2016, businessman Donald Trump was elected president, promising to make America great again. His term was marked by trade wars, controversial immigration policies, impeachment trials, and a deeply polarized political climate. Then, in 2020, the world was shaken again. The COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, killing millions and reshaping life as we knew it. Lockdowns, masks, vaccines, and overwhelmed hospitals became the new normal. In the midst of the crisis, George Floyd's death sparked a national reckoning on race and police brutality. Protests erupted across the country under the Black Lives Matter banner, demanding justice and reform. In 2021, Joe Biden became president, taking office in a country recovering from a pandemic, an economic crisis, and a riot at the U.S. Capitol, an event that shocked the world and tested American democracy. Today, with Donald Trump as the President of the United States, the country is still a land of contradictions, powerful yet divided, wealthy yet struggling with inequality, free yet still seeking justice for all. It faces challenges like cybersecurity threats, climate change, political polarization, and the ongoing fight for equity and inclusion. But it also remains a place of hope, resilience, and reinvention. America continues to lead in science, culture, and innovation. From Mars rovers to artificial intelligence, from space exploration to grassroots activism, the story of America is still being written by every citizen, every community, every generation. From native nations to new colonies, from revolution to civil war, from global conflict to the digital age, this is the story of America. Not perfect, not finished, but always moving forward. Well, dear viewers, we have come to the end of our video. If this journey through time moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment about which part of American history resonated most with you. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking, and keep writing your own part in history.